Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing diversity programming to our member institutions as well as all veterinary professionals. My name is Lisa Greenhill, and I'm the Senior Director for Institutional Research and Diversity at the AAVMC. So, on today's episode of the podcast, we are going to try to bring a bit of clarity to the murky world of service animals, emotional support animals, and comfort animals. What are they? What purpose do they serve? And how does the law, specifically the Americans with Disabilities Act, treat these animals in different spaces? So as we record this show, there was a recent incident in the news that's gone viral about an emotional support peacock that was declined boarding by an airline. The incident has sparked a lot, and I mean a lot, of online debate about the role of animals, human-animal bond, and just what does the ADA cover. So I am really excited to do this show. The timing, I guess, could not have been better. And so we'll try to tease out all of these issues today. And I'm delighted to welcome Scott Lissner, the Ohio State University's ADA coordinator and 504 compliance officer. Welcome.
Thank you.
So,
to be here.
So we'll try not to do too many bird puns today. But Scott, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and your role at OSU?
Okay, so I've been at OSU for about 18 years in this role as their central ADA compliance officer. I do disability policy and compliance and initiatives for the entire university. I work with the veterinary college. I happen to be on their diversity committee this year. I work with our medical school. I work with all of our professional schools and health school programs, as well as our undergraduate institution. My background is actually originally in counseling and cognitive psychology. Years ago, got into doing academic support services for students when the first group of students with disabilities began arriving on our campuses because of the passage of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act that gave colleges some obligations beginning back in 1977, and the what is now IDEA, which passed a couple of years before that and started providing special education services in K through 12. That first batch of students coming to college fell into kind of two categories. Students with sensory disabilities, blind, deaf, or wheelchair users were the obvious ones, but a fairly small statistical group. And then the larger statistical group was students with learning disabilities. Sure. So the college I was working in at the time said, oh, look, they're mostly with learning disabilities and he does tutoring. Maybe he should be responsible for these. So I got into working with students with disabilities that way, kind of purely by happenstance. It was not an uncomfortable place for me. And when I switched institutions, I became more, had a larger share of that responsibility. And when I began the job previous to this one in Virginia, the ADA was passing. We needed to update our transition plan and how we were going to approach the ADA from the plan we had been obligated to do under 504 some years earlier. And I went to my new vice president of business and legislative affairs and said, so I'm serving students. I should probably be working with your 504 compliance officer, who would be your new ADA coordinator. And he pulled a big, thick folder out of his cabinet, which I now know to be a minor miracle. That was his 1976 transition plan. And he got a very sheepish look on his face and said, well, the person who was doing this died about 4 years ago. you're the first person to make me take this out of my file cabinet. Congratulations. You are our new 504 compliance officer and ADA coordinator.
Congrats.
So that was roughly 30 years ago. Just shy of 30 years ago. So I've been in this role one way or another for a significant amount of time. I do a bit of teaching at our law school and for our disability studies program and for our College of Architecture. I'm a past president of the Association of Higher Education and Disability. That's the professional association that the Disability Resource Office staff on your campus probably belong to. And I'm a past president and currently their public policy chair. So that's probably enough.
busy. So as a side note for any young professionals out there who think that their career is going to take a straight linear line from graduation to retirement, that's typically not how it works. So, well, welcome to the show. Why don't we dive right on in? So, what are the different kinds of service kind of help animals?
Okay, so I'm gonna start by saying there's a lot of variation in language out there in the universe.
Okay.
Some of that is in the regulations and the various laws, but a lot of that is mostly just how we all choose to use language, and no one has agreed on a really solid taxonomy yet. But I'm going to give you mine.
Okay.
And I'll try to give you what the substitutes are. So broadly, there are assistance animals, animals that assist somebody with a disability. The Fair Housing Act uses that phrase specifically. The ADA does not. 504 does not. So it's a broad statement. The FAA and the Air Carriers Act uses that phrase, and the Peacock story, just as a frame of reference, the right potentially for the Peacock and the process by which the Peacock was denied access to board the plane were all under the Air Carrier Act rules. That was not under the ADA. That was under regulations in the Air Carriers Act. So that's not one the average veterinary college needs to worry too much about, since your college doesn't fly.
Sure.
So you're not covered by the Air Carriers Act. But assistance animals are the broad term. Within that, sometimes the phrase support animals is used broadly to cover all animals that provide support. Within that, you might divide the world into three groups for me, broadly. So one is service animals. A service animal is defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act, by the ADA. A service animal is a dog that has been trained to perform a behavior on cue that mitigates the impact of a disability.
Okay.
And occasionally you can use a miniature horse as a substitute.
Okay.
All right. So the basic rule on a service animal is it's been trained. There's no requirement for what that training looks like, but it has to perform a task on cue that's active and that potentially would mitigate the impact of a disability, or at least partially do so.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
What Justice did was recognize that some denominations within Islam consider a dog to be unclean based on a passage in the Quran,
right,
and will not share space with a dog. And they couldn't leave it at a service animal is only a dog, without potentially butting up against freedom of religion.
Sure.
And so they made an exception to say sometimes a miniature horse, as an exception to it being a dog. Miniature horses are not much bigger than German Shepherds. Much to my surprise, they can be housebroken.
Huh.
And there are about 25 in use in the country that I can identify, and only one that's ever been on a college campus that I know of. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of miniature horses, but if somebody has a miniature horse in harness, so to speak, you have to ask the questions.
Okay.
And so if a dog walks in your door, the questions the Department of Justice allows you to ask, because you are a place of public accommodation, whether you're a public college or a private college, you would fit that definition. Student walks in the door with a dog. I guess there's actually an extra question you might ask if it's over at the clinic. Is that a patient? Right.
Yeah, right.
But but under the assumption it's not your clinic space, you can ask, is that a service animal for a disability?
Okay.
That's a yes, no question. That's not a what disability do you have? But you
Okay.
are allowed to ask that. And you are allowed to ask, if it's not obvious, what service does it perform? And when you hear that service, it should be something that would happen to a queue, that's active, and a behavior that's identifiable, that might reasonably, to a reasonable person, be thought of as something that would reduce the impact of the disability. We'll come back to those questions and that definition
Sure.
as we move through the list of other animals. Then there are emotional support animals, sometimes called comfort animals. I would prefer to call them emotional support animals. Those are animals that it is the ongoing relationship for all of your faculty that do human bond research. This is kind of falling in your direction a little
Sure.
bit. Um, it's the ongoing passive relationship with the animal that helps to mitigate symptoms, control symptoms, reduce the impact of the disability. So it's not something the dog does that is any different from what a pet might do.
Mm-hmm.
It is the ongoing relationship with the dog. An emotional support animal is not got the pass that a service animal has. A service animal is allowed to pretty much go anywhere the person can go. If you have to put on protective gear to walk in that room, then that's a room that you can likely restrict a service animal from going into. If
Okay.
it's a sterile environment, if you don't let anybody in the door without goggles and boots, the dog can be kept outside unless it's wearing goggles and boots.
Okay.
And there are goggles for dogs,
Yeah.
and there
Yeah.
are boots
Yeah.
for dogs.
Yeah.
So we have had a dog in our chemistry lab, because the dog could meet the protective clothing requirement of clothes, shoes, and goggles that everyone who walked in the door had to meet, right?
Mhm.
So an emotional support animal is covered not by the ADA.
Okay.
The ADA only recognizes service animals, but an emotional support animal is covered, as I said, by the FAA and the Air Carriers Act, not a big concern here. It's covered by HUD
Okay.
under the Fair Housing Act, and we might have to reasonably permit an emotional support animal into our residence hall space.
Okay.
So they get on
Okay.
campus. Um, that process allows someone on your campus, based on your broader policies around disability and accommodation, to say, I want some documentation about your disability and your need for an emotional support animal. HUD, the Department of Transportation, and the FAA under the Air Carriers Act uh, don't recognize species limits. They don't say an emotional support animal is a dog and only a dog except for. They are broad. They do not
Okay.
recognize a particular species, and we'll come back to how one might choose what's a reasonable species and not to let in the door in a couple of moments. But that would be under those laws. After that, what might be generally referred to as pets maybe a companion animal, maybe a comfort animal at some level, but something that is not either a documented need for your disability or service animal is kind of everybody else. In your world, those might be patients, they might be research subjects, or they might be somebody's pets.
Sure.
Um,
So to be clear, I guess what I'm hearing you say, though, that so the function that emotional support animals serve is to mitigate symptoms of a disability, but they're not covered specifically under ADA. So does that mean then they, other than those, than housing and FAA and those types of scenarios, then there's greater restriction on where they can go?
There is greater restriction on where they can go, and there is a process you can put in place when it comes to emotional support animals that's more directive than the process for service animals.
For service animals. Okay. All right.
So I'm going to go back to the student walks in the door with a dog. Let's keep it at a dog for the moment and keep life simple. And you say, is that a service animal for a disability? And they say yes, because there's a lot of confusion out there. They're not necessarily trying to manipulate you. And they say, and you ask, what service does it perform? And the student says, it helps me control my anxiety. Maybe the student volunteers, I have PTSD and it helps me control my anxiety. Controlling your anxiety isn't a behavior. So you can ask, that's good. How does it control your anxiety? What how? Does it do? Right? What about the animal helps you to control your anxiety? There's a number of ways you could ask that question, but since they haven't described a behavior that would mitigate a disability, just an outcome, you can ask. Now, if they say, it senses my muscle tone, posture, and breathing rate. And when I ratchet up with an episode, it senses that and paws at my leg to get my attention and to anchor me to the here and now.
Okay. There's an action there that happens on cue, right?
That's a behavior happening on cue. So it's a service animal. It happens to be serving a disability that's a psychiatric disability or a mental health disability, but it's still a service animal. If they say, when I get anxious, I look down in its big brown eyes and at its smiling face, and I pick it up and it licks me and I feel all so much better. It might be an emotional support animal or it might be a pet, but that does not describe a service animal.
Right.
So at that point, you could say, it does not sound like a service animal. It sounds like an emotional support animal, maybe, or pet, or something else, and refer them into your reasonable accommodation process.
Okay.
Now, I don't want to assume every college does it a little bit differently.
Sure.
If you were at our veterinary school, you would go to one of our contacts within the veterinary school, who's kind of the point person for our disability services offices over there. It's a member of their staff, and he would work with our disability services office to get documentation that said you did indeed have a disability. This was indeed a reasonable accommodation to have the dog, and understand what the need for the dog was. Under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, rather than the ADA, which also covers every institution that receives any federal dollars on their campus. So that would be all of you.
Everybody.
Right. It is silent on animals. There is a passing statement in the regulation guidance about allowing a guide dog as an example of one type of accommodation, but it doesn't have the kind of language that the ADA has that limits it only to service animals, nor does it have the kind of language that the Fair Housing Act has that broadens it. So it is silent, and the Department of Education has recognized that an emotional support animal in various locations not covered by HUD on your campus, not
Okay.
covered by the Fair Housing Act, might be a reasonable accommodation.
Okay.
That your institution should engage its accommodation process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when we do that, we ask about what is it the dog does and how is it that it helps the individual manage its symptoms. That's a pretty reasonable level of information for our disability services office to ask. I wouldn't want our average faculty member engaging in that conversation.
Okay. Noted.
So we're really good about referring them to the
Sure.
right path.
Refer.
Now you want to look at what the right path is at your institution. As the compliance guy, my big concern is if it's not funneled through our disability services office or being done in collaboration with them, or my office if it's an appropriate issue, then I've got at OSU 5,000 decision makers about accommodations being reasonable, and that's a short path to a complaint, right?
Sure.
You
Sure.
can't be consistent if 5,000 individuals are making those decisions,
Right.
right?
Right.
So we
Right.
path them there and we ask those questions. I think it is a pretty high hurdle to say, I need this animal with me while I'm in class. The
Mm.
level of need that has to be documented there is a pretty high level of need when the presumption for an emotional support animal is it is the ongoing interdependence with the animal, the ongoing interactions that perform kind of a prophylactic palliative
Uh-huh.
impact on managing your symptoms and your disability. So
Right.
typically we might say, yes, you can have it in the residence hall. Where you live is different where you spend a little bit of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the
Mm-hmm.
students at our veterinary college spend some very long days at the veterinary college, and
Sure.
they might try to present an argument for why they would need the animal in class.
In that
Um,
situation.
and we would go through a decision-making process there and say, does it meet the threshold of a need? Is there an alternative effective accommodation?
Mm.
Is
Mm-hmm.
also something we get to ask. So we have a number of students who have made that request, and um, we will recognize that testing is a particularly high stress situation,
Mm-hmm.
and have offered those students, when possible, a schedule that allows breaks in the day so they can visit their animal, and identified testing in a reduced distraction individual testing room, which
Sure.
we'll do for other disabilities. And so you can have the dog with you during testing. Will that satisfy your needs?
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's a way of
Okay.
kind of minimizing the number of dogs in the classroom.
Right. As well as, I mean, the disruption to other students as well.
Well, so the disruption to other students is round two.
Yeah.
I'm speaking to an audience of veterinary professionals. I'm gonna make an assumption. I'm gonna be transparent about it in case I'm wrong. We don't all assume dogs are bad, evil, and misbehaved.
No.
You can't make that assumption about a dog that is an approved accommodation or a service animal any more than you should make it about the student who walks in the door
Right.
based on some overt aspect of the student,
Right.
race,
Right.
they're in a wheelchair, whatever. We shouldn't make broad assumptions based on that. The ADA for service animals, and certainly when we're in the world of emotional support animals, does not limit it to breed or size, but it does say it has to be in control.
Right.
So in
So do you
control, go ahead.
require so do you in approving these animals, I mean, I think that the general kind of understanding of what we would consider, I guess, a traditional service animal, which is, most of the time, like most folks see a lab, or a German Shepherd or something like that, right? But for emotional support animals, where it seems things are a bit grayer, then as a part of that kind of figuring out what those accommodations will be, is there a requirement or part of the process that kind of does a behavioral assessment?
So we can set a reasonable expectation of controlled behavior but we have to base it on what we're seeing. Even a
Okay.
service animal, while it, quote, has to be trained,
Right.
there's no certification, there's no registration, there's no licensing of service animals that is recognized by the law. There are lots of companies online that I can spend $89.99, send them a picture and a description, and they will send me a service animal registration card. If I read the fine print, it says on the card, this is based on information provided to us that we have not validated.
Right. So basically, if you bring your animal and it keeps it together for the for the hour long meeting.
So if you were in our disability services office requesting this and had the dog with you, they would observe the behavior. They would ask some questions about the behavior. Since on our campus, we require that all enrolled students have a clean bill of health,
Sure.
we can require that the animal have a clean bill of health. So we ask for rabies certification, and those kinds of things. If it is, that's one of the ways we can limit the non-domestic animals that might be brought as emotional support animals.
So there's our entree to the peacock story.
To the peacock.
That was a nice soft lob there. So what kinds of animals? I mean, I'm gonna make my own big assumption here that dogs, particularly I guess for our students, are often the ones that are being brought. But I also know vet students well enough to know that there's a menagerie of critters sometimes lurking about. So what have you seen, and how do those? And how do folks, and not just students, but folks in general, kind of demonstrate again that these animals are, that there's a behavior, that they're helpful.
All right. So I'm gonna start with kind of how it works under HUD a little bit.
Okay.
Because it's good guidance for how to deal with emotional support animals under 504. Since Section 504 doesn't have any specifics to it, relying on HUD's guidance is a pretty safe way to say, I've gone to a reliable source to figure out my process.
Right.
So HUD divides animals into two broad groups. There are service animals. HUD would encourage you to start with the two service animal questions.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a dog and it answers those questions that there's a cued behavior that makes sense, then it's a service animal.
Okay.
For HUD, if it's not a dog, but it does a behavior on cue that might mitigate the disability, that it's still an assistance animal.
Okay.
So, for instance, when they redid the ADA regulations back in 2010, they rewrote the pieces on service animals. That's where they restricted it to dogs and occasionally a miniature horse. And they explicitly eliminated monkeys, for instance.
Oh.
Capuchin monkeys are trained to work with people who are quadriplegic, have very limited use of their arms, limited or no use of their legs. They can be incredibly helpful around the house. But at the end of the day, a monkey is not a domestic animal, it is a wild animal that may or may not be effectively trained, but can never be entirely relied on to act like a domestic animal.
Right.
And carries a very large potential for zoonotic disease transfer as a primate. And based on CDC guidance and the fact that monkeys, even when trained, aren't always consistent behaviorally, they eliminated monkeys along with other animals when they wrote the ADA.
Okay.
But they haven't done that for HUD. So I might legitimately ask for a monkey in my residence because it can do a task. Gray African parrots are highly trainable. And they live a long time.
Yeah.
As birds go, they're very bright. And I have had a request for a gray African parrot that would chat and prompt a student to eat who had an eating disorder. And so she ate in her room,
Okay.
thankfully, because gray African parrots don't really belong in the dining hall. So, taking it out of her residence, it has to be under control. So that means on a leash, a harness, in a carrier or a cage, or if the service it performs requires that it not be leashed. So if it's a quadriplegic with maybe a small dog that does fetch and carry, that does goes fix things up. If it's on a leash, it can't really do its job, right? But it has to be within 2 to 3 feet and responsive to voice commands.
Okay.
Housebroken is on that list of under control. You can't really housebreak a parrot, as far as I know, right? So, that being the case, the parrot didn't travel, but she presented documentation. The next question was, can the parrot present a clean bill of health? Now, I have to say, I didn't do the first round approval on the parrot. And I probably would have said the vet's information was not adequate to our purpose. The vet said the parrot was healthy. My question is it healthy, and does it pose a minimal risk of zoonotic disease transfer?
Gotcha.
And if there is any protocols that would reduce that risk that the student should employ, what are those? That's the information I asked the student to get from the vet caring for the animal. It's really hard to get that information on exotic animals.
Okay. Sure.
Right? I mean, maybe within your veterinary colleges, you have folks who would do it, but the average vet is not likely, doesn't typically fill that out for hedgehogs and chinchillas and boa constrictors and tarantulas, which are all on the list of things I've seen as potential emotional support animals. And for that matter, for the peacock, if I were having someone request a peacock on our campus, it was denied because there are weight and size and toilet training, housebroken requirements under the regulations and under United Airlines policies. And they didn't question whether or not it was an emotional support animal. They said it didn't matter. It didn't qualify.
Right. So you raise a really interesting point, though, an important point for the veterinary community in general, and that really is that if the question about whether or not this animal can access certain spaces, what is that risk? It isn't just, is it healthy, which I think a lot of folks can certainly determine, right? A lot of professionals can determine that piece, but really kind of assessing the risk for transmissible zoonotic diseases, and that is really the crux of the one of those central questions around access.
Right, and particularly when it's a request that relates to housing in a college residential environment.
Sure.
So if I'm not supposed to, but if there's a risk of salmonella from the feces from a hedgehog or a bearded dragon, and I'm not supposed to clean the cage in a sink that's typically used for bathing, cleaning, or food preparation, and I live in a residence hall, how does that work for you?
How does that work? Well, and I imagine, I mean, some of those same issues for us in a teaching facility, particularly in clinics, are the same issues, right? Not necessarily, whether or not you make ramen in the sink, but really that there are, for our purposes in teaching facilities, it's not just an issue of whether or not that animal is a risk, but questions for the owners who are using these animals. Is that animal at risk being in a clinical facility that is designed to treat sick animals?
So that's an issue, but not to offend any of the people online, my understanding of the legal status of a dog is it's chattel. It's property,
Mm.
and it's not your property.
Mm.
And whether or not I want to risk damage to my dog or my computer is kind of not your business, but mine.
Right.
Risk to others
Right.
is your business.
Right. Right. Sure.
Does the dog pose a risk to other patients that it might be exposed to in a clinical setting?
Sure.
That's probably a yes.
Sure.
I don't see bringing an animal into an area where you are doing live clinical exams. I think there's a reasonable argument about um, disease transfer, cleanliness,
Mm-hmm.
etc.,
Mm-hmm.
that you might undertake. Of course, if that clinical exam is done in a non-sterile environment next to 5 other animals, one of which is a pet dog that happens to be on the property, that might be a hard argument to make, that
Sure.
a well cared for dog presents a greater risk
Risk.
than if I've got a large animal program and I'm out on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
um, the question is, can the dog behave itself out on the farm, right?
Right.
Can it be maintained in control, not distress the other animals, as opposed to that being risk transfer? Labs generally, I think, require a pretty high hurdle to bring the dog in, but
Yeah.
many of our labs are not sterile labs. And
Mm.
certainly our didactic classes where we're lecturing and showing slides and
Sure.
talking, we've got no basis for saying there's a higher risk there than in the art history class down the hall or across campus. And so we would let dogs, clearly dogs, if they're approved to have access, if they're a service animal, would easily go in. Most exotics, you're going to have limits in terms of toilet training. You're
Sure.
going to have limits in terms of control and you'll have, a reasonable, done in conjunction with your disability services, disability resource office, perhaps a really good kind of direct threat analysis to
Mm.
others. And in your case, others would include your patients in your
Right.
clinics, not necessarily in the rest of your spaces, but certainly
Right.
in your clinics.
In the clinics.
I would really encourage you, if you haven't, to reach out to your disability services office, who has, I would be willing to bet most of next week's paycheck would dearly love to legitimately find ways to control and limit the number of animals on campus. The field of at the AHEAD conferences, they are as concerned as anyone with the, range of questionable documentation
Mm-hmm.
and the increase
Mm-hmm.
in use of animals on campus and the apparent increase in use of less than legitimate
Okay.
animals on campus.
Right.
I want to be real clear, though, there are some real legitimate uses
Absolutely.
beyond the traditional service dog,
Got
and we need to take those into account. But I'm also a realist, and I've gotten documentation that I know came from dogtor.com, DOGKTOR, $89.99. You get
Yeah.
the limited access package, and they approve your emotional support.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was really surprised that there's, and kind of doing some of the background for this show, kind of that there isn't a kind of national group that really just kind of oversees some of this stuff or advocates for it. I mean, there's just lots and lots of groups, and yeah, you pay your money and you go on Amazon, you get a vest, and
Right.
you know.
So you can ask the questions. My guidance for you as faculty, is to work closely where you can kind of refer it up the ladder when you have questions, and
Mhm.
not take on all of the decision making and all of the risk of making a bad decision, or
Right.
one that doesn't quite follow a good process, by collaborating and reaching out to your disability services office. I also encourage you to look really carefully. We anchor our treatment and our interactions with requests for animals and our expectations to our codes of conduct on campus.
Mm.
We will not let a student howl all night at least not if somebody complains in the residence hall or in our classes. And so we won't let a dog do those things.
Do that either.
Right? We will not let a student just go to the bathroom anywhere they want and walk away. Maybe on a football Saturday, but typically no. We won't let a dog do that. They have to clean
Right.
up after the dog,
Right.
respect areas that we've designated as
Right.
toileting areas or non-toileting areas.
Sure.
And we won't let a student walk across our campus and randomly run up to people and lick them. So we
Good
will not let
policy.
dogs
Good policy.
do that.
That's a different show.
So, and no, dogs are not covered by Title IX.
That's a different show. That's a different show,
different altogether. But my point is, we use our code of conduct as an anchor for expectations for the dog.
Sure.
And if somebody had an animal with them in class and the animal gave a little yelp, whimpered, made some distracting noise, I might say to the student, gee, student, you need to keep your animal quiet so it doesn't disturb class. Because if a student was at that level disruptive, I wouldn't kick them out of the building.
Right. Right.
If they can't keep it under control and it repeats, at some point you can say, you've been warned, told you a second time, really, please don't bring the dog back until you have evidence that the dog will not be disruptive in class.
Right.
And then you can work with your disability services office and your conduct office over what that evidence might be. Because it's the student's conduct you're controlling, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're responsible for the dog. We treat them as a team, as one, right?
Right. So as we're drawing to a close here, I want to make sure that folks kind of have some clarity around the questions that, if you have what you believe is a service or assistance animal, we use that term. Those first questions are, is this a service animal? Mm-hmm. And then what specifically does it do on cue? What's the behavior?
What service does it perform?
Right. And then then that's the break point.
Right. Then you get an answer that you can say sounds like a behavior on cue that might mitigate the impact of a disability, might reduce the impact of a disability, or it sounds like, it's more the relationship with the dog or it's not clear. And then you can ask some follow-up questions based on that.
Right.
I often tell our faculty member, if the space is a space that we would let a service animal in the door, if we knew it was a service animal, and the animal, particularly if it's a dog, is well behaved and under control, that it's not especially problematic for the faculty member to say, I'm not sure it's a service animal. I'm going to give you provisional permission. I'm going to give you permission for today, as long as the animal is under control and not disruptive, for you to keep the animal in class.
Okay.
And then we're going to go over to our disability services office and let them figure out, or our ADA coordinator, or our point person in the vet school, whoever it is on your campus, and walk through the larger process. And if documentation is needed, get documentation before the dog can come back.
Gotcha. All right.
And that would be a pretty reasonable approach.
Sure.
I do want to really quickly hit two more possibilities. So state law is highly variable. Before you go, here's our rules, you need to check with state law. Okay. So in Ohio, service animals in training within some boundaries, I won't bore you with our law, are covered and have access. So you need to recognize state law might be different and might add other animals to your list.
To the mix. Okay.
Other roles of animals to the list. Some state laws also recognize a broader range of animals, right, than the ADA does. So you got to take that into account. The ADA will always defer to a law that gives wider access than it requires.
Okay.
And it will always trump a law that gives less access than it requires. That's built into the regulations. That's built
Sure.
into the
Sure.
statute. So the two other animals I want to just mention briefly are, quote, therapy dogs. They're trained.
Ah.
There are training organizations that certify them. That's not a legal certification. That's their certification. Their certifications usually require that you carry liability insurance either through the organization or independently. And those are the kinds of dogs people bring to visit patients in the hospital,
Okay.
in retirement homes. We might have one visit the library during final exams
Hmm.
so students can de-stress with the dog, because we all know pets are good for us, right?
Right.
And that's a healthy interaction. Uh, so, and then there are people raising service animals, and in some states, they
Hmm.
have rights for a service animal in training. So, one strategy you might consider is reaching out to the local organizations that do certified visiting therapy animals, and organizing some programming occasionally on site to make students less likely to want to bring their own dogs.
Mm.
You
Yeah.
might even consider whether the college, as the veterinary college, wants to designate and train one as, I don't know, a class project
Oh.
and provide that service to the library, to
Hmm.
people who request it across campus. That instead of it being, somebody's going to have to ultimately be responsible
Right.
as the keeper of the dog, so to speak. But you could work with a team of students and make it a project. Similarly, you could do that to raise a dog, or to do the socialization of a dog
Hmm.
that's being trained as a service animal. The kind of the middle stage. There's puppy raising.
Right.
There's getting it out and about and socialized in a wide range of environments.
Hmm.
College campus is the definition of a wide range of environments, right? So you could, as a class project, perhaps, or
Hmm.
a student organization project, socialize a service animal.
Okay.
Uh, those are animals you place all the limits on you want to,
Right.
but they might have a positive impact on reducing the number of requests for animals in other contexts.
In this context, those are great ideas. Thank you very much, Scott. So any final parting words?
So I was going to put together a list of some resources that would
Great.
give people a link to the laws and the regulations, and maybe a quick handout on kind of the chaotic world of what animal is what, that I thought would be helpful to folks that you could post online alongside this
Absolutely. That'd be
program.
great. Thank you so much. Those types of resources are always necessary and super helpful. Wonderful.
Well,
Thanks,
thank
Scott.
you. And if I can be of help again, give me a holler.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Scott Lissner from the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. We really appreciate your taking this hour and spending some time talking about service animals, assistance animals. Is that the broader kind of overarching?
Yeah. So I
Just
would
pick one.
I think assistance animals covers every animal being used to provide assistance for a disability, in my mind at least. So
Gotcha.
I think that's a good, really broad term.
Term.
And then, when you start talking specifics, I think it's always good to be clear. We're talking about a service animal and a place that is open to the public to walk in the door. Educational settings count for that. We're covered by that. So that's kind of the ADA and 504, versus perhaps HUD and the Fair Housing Act, or transportation,
FAA and all of
all
that.
those other places out there in the universe.
All right. Well, we will continue watching and waiting. We know that the air carriers are increasingly putting some restrictions, or at least publicly, kind of putting some restrictions on the boarding, the access to boarding.
And they've always had some rules, and I'm the first to admit that some of the airlines have been over generous for whatever reason in the range of things they've said yes to in the past. Delta has recently done a new set of rules that are have some restrictions in them that are a bit problematic in my mind because I don't think they accomplished the task at hand.
Mm.
So they've asked for a clean bill of health from the vet, which
gets to that questions. Those
gets
questions
to
we
some of
raised
those questions. But they've also set a policy about how you upload that and get that to them. And so if I'm a guide dog user because I'm blind and I use adaptive technology on my computer, between my vet and Delta Airlines, uploading documentation within 48 hours of my flight might be a little bit of a
challenge.
If Delta hasn't done a really good job with their website, might be a problem for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And because they can't do it well, and it's hard to do that document upload. Or let me rephrase that. It's not really hard to make that accessible. It's just unusual for companies to do so.
Right.
Uncommon, it's not all that difficult. It's just
it's uncommon.
Yeah.
Well, we will be doing a follow-up show later this spring with an animal behavioralist, kind of talking about assistance animals and this issue of under control, air quote, and what does that mean, and what kinds of behaviors what does that look like, right, in different settings. So, folks, be sure to check out that show that we'll be doing later this spring. And so with that, I will bring this show to a close. Thank you so much again, Scott. Don't worry, we will probably call you again on other ADA and 504 related issues as our new resident expert.
Well, thank you.
We really appreciate your taking the time to kind of help bring a little bit of clarity to this issue of assistance animals. So with that, we will wrap this episode. Be sure to like our Facebook page, Diversity and Inclusion on Air at AAVMC on Facebook. If you have questions about our show, please do not hesitate to drop me an email at diversitymatters@aavmc.org and subscribe on SoundCloud, your favorite iTunes app, Stitcher, all of those podcast apps. Be sure to check out back episodes and subscribe so that you get the new content as it comes out. So with that, thank you again, Scott. We really appreciate you joining us, and we will say goodbye.